When we knew this PDP-11 was coming, we stumbled on this operating system that was being developed at AT&T Bell Laboratories called Unix. I remember writing a letter to them asking about it. Next thing I knew, I got a letter back that says, okay, you can now have it. And we were the first licensed customer, in quotes, of Unix outside AT&T. We worked together with a fellow from Harvard, which was also planning on doing a Unix implementation. So Brent Beyer from Harvard and I went over to Harvard's chemistry building on weeknights and brought the first Unix system up there in late spring of '73 using the Children's Museum's license. And it was fascinating. There was a lot to learn. A whole new language, C programming language, which nobody had seen before except the people at Bell. The version of Unix that we got was the first one that was written in C. So as I said, we were clearly bleeding edge. After we got to PDP-11, it opened so many new opportunities to us, including the ability to begin to use it for some of the museum's management needs. And I remember spending several meetings with the museum's management team discussing what it was we were going to do first and how we were going to approach it and all those kinds of things. And I was making these decisions without any formal training in systems theory or in organizational decision making. They simply fell out naturally out of the museum's way of doing things, where you get everybody in a room and you talk about it for a little while and the answer materializes. Happened more times than I can count. So we got the first round membership system functioning, and then the next thing we did was to begin to look at the accounting software. And there was this wonderful budget reporting system, which Tom Goldsmith had put together using a mainframe at StrideWrite. I remember when I sat with Tom to talk about what was going to be involved in doing this, and I think it was Phil O'Connell and you had asked me to have this conversation with him. And I'm saying, okay, I'm going to design the data structures with Tom, but that's not where his head was. So we had I think a conversation that left both of us kind of cold at the beginning, because he was thinking in terms of the batch processing model, right, and I was already thinking in terms of what do we display on the screen, where and how does it fit on the screen, and where does it get stored. But eventually I figured out what it was he was doing, and Ken Wills was another key player. He was the museum's auditor at that time. I remember him handing me a 8.5 by 11 book, about a ½ inch thick, called something like Teach Yourself Accounting. And it literally was a workbook approach to learning accounting. So I learned all about double entry accounting within a couple months. And that led me to think about some of the things that Tom had been doing, because what Tom was really doing was taking the data that Mary Bobine, our bookkeeper, had in her manual ledger sheets and key punching it and turning it into data that could be converted into reports. And because of my systems background and approach to things, I began looking at, okay, what's the better thing to do with technology as it stands today, yeah, to solve this problem? So that instead of Mary having to make the manual entries in her ledger, she begins to enter them into the computer directly. And the computer produces her ledger when she wants to see it that way, yes, rather than her having to fill out all those things by hand. One of the things I learned throughout that entire process, working with her and working with others at the museum, was learning how to meet people where they are, yeah, which I actually figured out from meeting 6-year-olds where they were, explaining to them, yeah, how to use a computer, yeah, and what a keyboard was and why the letters were here and all that sort of stuff. That kind of mental shift I could apply to other situations. That is a learning model that has recurred time after time after time, of course. If you figure out how to meet people where they were, if you take enough time to listen to them, yeah, yeah, you can figure out everything you need to know about how to reach them with your new idea and present it in a way that it becomes, oh, their new idea too.
Yeah.
Which I think was part of the magic of that era. But my memory of that interaction was that it was really very little of it. I remember thinking that I was really going to be able to take what he had designed and simply re-implement it on this new computer, but there was sufficient cultural difference between the batch-oriented computing world and the time-sharing or interactive computing world that it wasn't going to be that straightforward. So I had to do a lot more inventiveness than I anticipated. Once I got over the hump that probably lasted me a day of, what did I walk into here? And began to approach it as a problem that I could solve, it got interesting and exciting. Which again is something that happened many, many times at the museum in many, many settings. I had some relatively minor in terms of time interactions with David. That was more, I guess in the family model, he was the grandfather. You know, keeping an eye over things just to be sure everything was going okay, but he didn't have his fingers in the soup. Phil and I spoke often and regularly, and I was running ideas past her, and again I was having to translate them into language that she would understand as a manager. But my memory of her was that she was, if not enthusiastic, certainly accepting and encouraging, absolutely. Yeah. And particularly once you established a little bit of credibility with her. Right. It didn't take a whole lot. She would begin to go with you and trust you and encourage you forward. And she didn't know or care about the details about which bytes were going where in the computer. Right. She cared about what came out in the reports and how readable the reports were. And I remember several times having discussions with her about changes we could make to the reports. One of the curses that turned into a blessing, when Digital gave us the PDP 1140, the printer they gave us only took narrow paper. Now, previous to this time, everybody had been getting all their printouts on the standard 15-inch wide green bar paper, right? No, we had this thing that could only do 9.5-inch wide paper. So instead of giving people those green bar things, shortly we were giving them white paper with the Children's Museum logo screened on in official color as the background, printed by our own computer internally, and it was 8.5 by 11, so they could do whatever they wanted with it. It just made it much more manageable. Yeah. And it could actually fit in their mailboxes, mail slots. Yeah. Yeah. I remember many evenings spending, seemed like an hour, but I'm sure it was 10 minutes, filing all the printouts from that month in people's inboxes. I had dreamt of getting to the point where there was enough technology presence in the organization that people could be using the stuff from their desktops rather than dealing with the monthly reports, but the timing just didn't work out that way. The front pages, of course, were the numbers, the 5 columns of current month actual and budget, year-to-date actual and budget, and annual budget. And I remember the early version on the wide paper doing something different about highlighting the discrepancies in some way. I can't recall if there was another column for the difference between the two or what, but there was something like that. Yeah. But all of a sudden, when we had to fit it onto 8.5 by 11 paper, there wasn't that room for that many columns. And I believe that was when I came up with the idea of just flagging them by putting a U in an unfavorable column. Yeah. So that you could quickly scan down and say, oh, these are the places where I've got trouble. And then figure out how to deal with it. In the first go-round, those reports were what they were. But then, as I dug into the system more and as it became more complete, in terms of Mary being able to do her data entry directly into the computer instead of to her ledger sheets and then transcribing it, I realized that it was equally possible to take the data once it was in the system and chew on it in different ways so that we could produce, in addition to the big general ledger for everything in the museum that she was seeing, we could take a slice of it for this individual project or this combination of projects and offer people the opportunity of getting that as a backup to their budget statement. That transaction detail did make things run a lot smoother from a managerial perspective. People who cared about managing the budget and who were concerned about perturbations that they were seeing that they couldn't explain suddenly had the detail available to them, as opposed to having to go over and sit in Mary's office and either dig through her big printout or through the file cabinets, whatever it was. And I also implemented it in such a way that we could regulate who got that level of detail by the specific project, by the department into which that project rolled up, or by the person who was getting the printout.
That's right.
And you could actually give the same information sliced and diced different ways to different people.
That's right.
Which helped to manage some of the political concerns that I think you were alluding to. So we weren't giving everybody in the world all the transaction detail that showed the salary lines for each and every, for each and every employee. Yeah. And because of the way I happened to design the system, and this was a happenstance, good architecture as it happened, but I didn't know it, I didn't consciously do it that way. I was able to capitalize on some of those design decisions to make it not that difficult to implement those changes as the system matured.